Are you ready for the word? Yes, go to Acts 21, please. Or excuse me, Acts 22. Acts 22. According to Acts 21, Paul's been arrested in Jerusalem. I'm going to read to you just a couple of verses there. You can look if you wish. Verse 27 says, when the 7 days were almost ended, that's verse 27 of chapter 21, the Jews which were of Asia, when they saw Paul in the temple, stirred up all the people and laid hands on him, crying out, men of Israel, help! They were serious. Help! This is the man that teaches all men everywhere against the people and the law and this place, and further brought Greeks also into the temple and has polluted this holy place. So they're asking for help to get this man named Paul, because they said he's against Israel, he's against Torah, and he's against the temple, and he's polluted our holy place. Verse 31 of chapter 21 says they were trying to kill him, and they would have done so had soldiers not come in and arrested him. Now think about that for a minute. They didn't arrest the people that were beating him. They arrested the one that was getting beaten. Verse 35 says the soldiers they were carrying him to the castle. Verse 35 says that Paul had been beaten so severely that the soldiers were having to carry him up the stairs. And these that were against Paul had stirred up a mob, and a mob was following, shouting against him, wanting him killed. They wanted him dead. So as they get to the top of the stairs, Paul lets the soldiers know, hey, I'm a Roman. And I would like an opportunity to speak to these folks. And so they sat him down, let him turn around and start talking to the folks. And that's where we're going to pick up in Acts 22, verse 1. Men and brethren and fathers, hear my defense which I make now unto you. And when they heard that he spoke in the Hebrew tongue to them, they kept the more silence. And he said, I am verily a man which am a Jew, born in Tarsus, a city in Cilicia, yet brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, and taught according to the perfect manner of the law of the fathers, and was zealous toward YAHWEH as you all are this day. And I persecuted this way unto the death, binding and delivering into prisons both men and women, as also the high priest does bear me witness, and all the estate of the elders, from whom also I received letters unto the brethren, and went to Damascus to bring them which were there bound unto Jerusalem for to be punished. And it came to pass that as I made my journey and was come nigh unto Damascus about noon, suddenly there shone from heaven a great light round about me, and I fell upon the ground, or fell unto the ground, and heard a voice saying unto me, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Paul continues with his defense and starts sharing his amazing testimony there in Acts 22. He wants these people to know how he went from being somebody like them who persecuted those who followed Yeshua to being a man who actually followed Yeshua. He's saying, I was like you. Let me tell you what happened that changed me to the man that I am today. That passage came to mind this morning as I was as we gather here to celebrate our 20th anniversary. I want you to understand as a start, I'm in no way comparing myself to Paul, nor would I dare compare anything, any battle I've ever fought to be anything like the battles that Paul faced and the battles Paul fought. But I certainly can relate to his situation. And there are those who wonder, and there are those who get stirred up because I am no longer a Southern Baptist, which I was for most of my life. I am no longer Word of Faith, which I was for many years of my life. And they wonder how I got to where I'm at. And those of you who have been here for the last 20 years have heard snippets of stories over the last 2 decades that tell of how this transition took place, I've never taken a service to share the whole story. And I don't think we can celebrate our 20 years and talk about who we are and how we got here without sharing my story. And so I'm going to share as much of it as possible. There's no way to tell it all, but I do want to put it all in one service. So bear with me as I do that. I think it needful to explain to those who view us on Facebook and to those who view us on YouTube who we are. And so I'm going to attempt to do that today. And I'm going to start by talking about me when I was 11 or 12 years old. I don't know. I may have been a year or two younger, may have been a year or two older. But somewhere in that 11, 12-year-old age, I remember at that age going to New Lebanon Baptist Church. I wasn't carried there by my parents. I was picked up by an older couple known to me only as Mr. and Miss Leachman. They drove a Studebaker. I remember that. And I could stand out in the yard and I could see them from about at least 3/4 of a mile away as they came toward my house, and I would meet them on the road and ride to church with them. Sometimes my brothers would do so as well. I bring that up because standing in the yard many days waiting on them to come, sometimes my brothers would be out there with me. Sometimes the neighbor kids, Carl and Don Farmer, would be out there with us. And so while we waited, I'd preach. Now, I've said this before. What I mean by I would preach is I'd have them sit down and I'd take my Bible and I'd read it real loud. I still do that to this day, I think. But I'd read to them real loud and make my points, and while we waited on them, or sometimes Ralph and Nelda would pick us up. Eventually a church bus got to where it would pick us up. Around 15 years old, maybe a few months before I turned 15, but Mom and Dad would let me drive the car to church. And so I would go Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, driving the car to church. And a lot of times, mostly on Sunday nights, I would leave the church, and there was an old logging road not far from it, and I'd pull down in that logging road and just wait. Wait till I knew everybody had left. Then I'd go back, raise the window, make sure one was unlocked before I left, and I'd raise the window of that church, and I'd climb in and turn the lights on, and I would preach the empty pews. Do the best I could to preach the empty pews. It was just something burning in me to do that from as far back as I can remember. I shared with you not long ago, I think, that when we were back at New Lebanon back in February, burying my dad, excuse me, we laid his body in the ground. We didn't bury him. And but when we were there, I think it was Stephanie who pointed at that old white church that's still there and said, "Is that the one you climbed in the window of?" And that was it. It's still there. I did that for a long time. Now in high school, once I got to high school, my love and my passion became sports, particularly football. I wanted to play football, and I wrestled. But my senior year, I tore my knee up in a wrestling match. You spell that with an R. Tore my knee up, and the few offers that I had to play football after high school disappeared. So that was a tough situation, to deal with, trying to figure out what I was going to do, because all I ever thought I might do was go play football. But I had the Baptist folks from New Lebanon who I had been attending there all my life. They helped me out a lot by telling me that God had knocked me flat on my back so I'd look up. Isn't that amazing? Doing all you know to do to serve Him, and you got people telling you that God tore your knee up. That's a terrible doctrine to teach people, isn't it? But anyway, struggling with this, what to do, but at least it did slow me down so I had time to think and consider. On May 23rd of 1976, I went forward on a Sunday night. You have a Sunday night sermon, and there's an invitation. I went forward on a Sunday night invitation, took the hand of my pastor, who was Ted Traylor, and I said, I think God's calling me to preach. And we talked briefly there at the altar that night, and then I committed myself to do that very thing. May 28th, 1976, 5 days later, Bill and I would graduate from St. Clair County High School. But within a day or two of making that announcement, of saying on May 23rd, I'm committing myself to preach, at the high school, we only had a few days left, but at the high school, I was stopped in a hall by Brother Fox. Jesse, is that his name, Bill? Brother Jesse Fox. He was a pastor of a Presbyterian church there in town, but he was also the bus driver for the football team. So I'd gotten to know him through that, but he stopped me and he said, I heard you're a preacher. I said, well, I guess so. He said, good. He said, I want you to come preach such and such a day. After you get back from your senior trip, I got to go to Pensacola first, but after you get back from your senior trip, I want you to come preach. So he set it up for a Sunday morning, and I went to preach my very first sermon to people, He had a great big old huge wooden podium. And the only thing I remember about that day is that I was so nervous that if I touched that wooden podium, it rattled the floor. So I couldn't touch it. That's how nervous I was. But I did the best I could and preached my first sermon. 2 or 3 weeks later, my home church asked me to preach on a Sunday night. I did that. And then the pastor of the local Methodist church, Brother Johnny, what's Johnny's last name, Bill? Johnny Stewart. Brother Johnny Stewart caught me. I saw him at a store, I think it was. Stopped to get gas or something, and I saw him, and he said, I hear you're preaching. I said, I am. He said, well, you're going to preach a revival for me. And he set it up. And so I preached on Sunday morning. On Sunday night, several of the local churches in the area closed down, and they all came to the revival. And I remember Sunday night walking out there, or looking out, and seeing the front rows full of preachers. And I said to Brother Johnny, this place is full of preachers. And maybe somebody else ought to preach. And he said, those are the best friends you got out there, son. Go preach. Well, I did. I preached my first revival. Revival is a series of meetings you just have all in a row at a particular time of the year, in other words. But anyway, I preached that first revival, and it was an interesting adventure. But from there, I preached anywhere and everywhere I got an invitation, and I was getting a lot of invitations. Preachers would call me sometimes on Sunday morning and say, hey, I don't feel good today. Can you come preach? Yes, sir. I'll be right there. I stayed ready to go. Somebody called. I wanted to go preach. And so I did. In the fall of that year, I enrolled at Samford University because I thought if I was going to be a preacher, I need to go to a Southern Baptist school and get Southern Baptist trained. I came home and told my dad I've enrolled at Samford University. He said, you did what? I said, I enrolled at Samford University. Son, I can't pay for that. I said, I didn't ask you to pay for that. Then how are you going to pay for it? I said, I don't know. God will have to do it. That's the only name I knew him by at the time. I said, God will have to do it. And he did. Year after year after year, he did. I did leave Sanford for a short while. Got a itch thinking I did still want to play football. Found a little school out in Kansas that would let me. Took off out there, only to find out I didn't want to play football. What I really wanted to do was get married. And so I came home that spring of 1977. Marie graduated high school June 3rd of 1977, and we got married June the 4th of 1977. So after that, I went to work for her uncle, who owned a plastic pipe manufacturing company called Cloud Plastic. Worked there for a while, but they worked 10 days on, 4 days off. I couldn't work weekends and preach. So I left there, went to work. Well, my dad worked for a little while, but eventually went to work for a place called Stockham Valves and Fittings in Birmingham, Alabama. The most horrible place I think I've ever worked in my life. It was. I used to do this to my children when years and years later, when we drive up and down the interstate. You can see Stockham Valve right off the interstate there in Birmingham. Every time we go by it, I'd roll the window down. I say, y'all hear that? Hear what, Dad? There's weeping and gnashing of teeth in that place. And I'd raise the window back up. I've never had a job that I hated from the first day like I did that job. I hated it from the first day. But I was back there running a lathe, making brass parts. And I was back there one night. I think I'd worked there about a year and a half, but I was back there one night running that lathe. And somebody tapped me on my shoulder. And didn't know him. I turned around and said, yes, sir. He said, can you cut that off and talk to me for a second? Certainly can. We walked outside and sat down on a bench, and he said, my name's Johnny Martin. No kin. He said, my name's Johnny Martin. And I'm a deacon at Central Baptist Church, and we're looking for a pastor and sure would like to talk to you. Found in a place where I didn't ever think I'd be found. So we talked, and sure enough, went there. I don't know what you know about Baptist churches, but you have to preach trial sermons, right? Preached a few of those, and those were okay. So they voted, and they voted me in as their pastor, and I went there to pastor, and I was only 20 years old. I wouldn't recommend that for anybody. I think the Bible even advises against it, right? I often wondered how people in their 40s, 50s, and 60s would want a 20-year-old, 19-year-old pastoring them. Through experience, I found out the reason they wanted it and it was okay with them is most of them didn't read their Bible. And if you read it any at all, you were a step ahead of them. I don't mean that critical. I'm just saying that most of the Bible teaching they got was whatever you delivered to them in a sermon on Sunday morning or Sunday night. But anyway, I'm grateful to those people for the opportunity they gave me. But I want to share this with you, and I'm getting to the first main point about how we got to where we are. Being my first pastorate, now I'm to be ordained as a Baptist pastor. I don't know if you've ever seen an ordination or been involved in an ordination, but they bring in what they call a presbytery. Local pastors or officials in the Southern Baptist Association, and they examine you. And so we go into a room and they sit there and fire questions at me. Sometimes encouraging, but most of the time just firing questions at me. And near the end of it, they're doing this just an hour or so and working up to the time we're to go out and do the ordination in front of the whole congregation. But just as we got to the near the end of it where we're to go out, the oldest of the Southern Baptist preachers and the leader really of the association said this to me. Well, Steve, before we ordain you, I need you to promise me that if you start seeing anything in the Bible or start believing anything in the Bible that does not agree with Baptist doctrine, I need you to promise me you won't preach it. And I thought about that for a second, and I said, well, I can't make you that promise. Well, why not? I said, why would I believe something and not preach it? That doesn't make any sense to me. Well, I've got problems with that then. I said, well, I got problems with promising you that I'll believe something and not teach it. And he continued to press, and some of the others continued to press. And I really thought it was over because, number one, I couldn't believe he was making that demand. Number two, what he's actually saying is, we've been where you are, and you're going to find things in the Bible that contradict what we believe, and we want you to promise you're not going to teach it just like we don't. That's what he was asking. And I refused to make that promise. So I'm bewildered by it all. Finally, my pastor, Ted Traylor, soothed it over. I don't even remember how he soothed it over, but they agreed to go ahead, and I think he assured them, this boy's Baptist. But they ordained me. I enrolled back, after I started pastoring there, I was able to enroll back into Sanford University. I'd go a semester, have a kid, and drop out a year. I'd go a couple of semesters, have another kid, and drop out a year. And so I crammed 4 years of school into 9 years, eventually graduating from Sanford University. That church was Central Baptist Church in Argo. We eventually left there and went to Pastor Glenwood Baptist Church up in Morris, Alabama. Before I get to Morris, though, I got to tell you about one. Before I started pastoring at Central, there were a couple of adventures that's just worth mentioning in a service like this. One of them was, I told you I'd preach anywhere and I'd preach everywhere. One of the places I preached, and I served as an interim pastor there before I even got married. So I was 18, 19 years old serving as an interim pastor at Akmar Baptist Church. And I served as interim pastor there for a long time. Now, Akmar Baptist Church had long died before I got there. It was made up of 3 widow ladies, 3 of them. And they were holding on the best they could to that place, but it was gone. And there was another family that came, the parents of my good friend Donnie Tucker. His parents attended there occasionally, but they were always late. And back in those days, a long sermon for me was 15 minutes. So sometimes they would come in and sit down, and just as they sat down, I would say, okay, if everybody would stand up, and we'd dismiss, because 15 minutes was as long as I could imagine going, and I hadn't even got started yet today, and we're in about 30 minutes of it, aren't we? Another place that was worth mentioning was, I think this was right after Marie and I had gotten married. I was asked to come preach a revival, and don't even remember how I met these folks, but it's Sodom Baptist Church. Now, if you can imagine, the name of the church was Sodom. Sodom Baptist Church. The front door only had one hinge, so it was sitting crooked. It was... I'm not going to say too much about it, but it was an interesting place to be. I preach Sunday morning, I preach Sunday night, I preach Monday night, and while you're preaching, people are up and moving, they're walking, they're stirring. Sunday night or Monday night, early on, I'm preaching with all of my heart, just as hard as I can go. The pastor's wife is sitting on the front row with her hand on the bench, and over her shoulder, she sees somebody come in. Right while I'm preaching, she just glanced over her head and saw him and said, "Well, hey, Betty, glad you're here. Come on up here and sit down." And I just never seen anything like that in my life. And it went on like that the whole week. But on either Wednesday or Thursday, I'd had enough. And I stood up and I said to those folks, "Listen, I've devoted this week to come here and preach. And I've done the best I can to come here and preach. Now you're going to sit down, you're going to shut up, and you're going to listen to what I got to say." You know what? They did. And we had 6 or 7 folks get saved that night. So we had a great time. But then I'm back to where we go to Glenwood Baptist Church, and I'm in school pastoring there. When we went there, they had around 45, 48 people on average in Sunday school. So I was working a part-time job, I was working a full-time job. I was pastoring there, and I was going to school. That meant I taught Sunday school, taught training union. Everybody in here know what training union is? It's just a Sunday night class like Sunday school, except it's at night. So I taught Sunday school, taught training union, preached Sunday morning, preached Sunday night, preached Wednesday night, worked a 40 to 50 hour a week job, and went to school. I was living off about 4 or 5 hours sleep a night. When you're young, you can do that. I wouldn't advise it, but you can do it. Eventually, the church grew to a place where I could go full time, and that was awesome. We're meeting in a little white building with the phallic symbol on top. We were able to tear that down, and we built a new sanctuary that would seat almost 400 people. We were averaging 120, 150. It was a wonderful time. I graduated while I was pastoring there from Sanford University. I would have graduated in 1985. And when I graduated, I had something I'd never had before in my life. Time. Up until that point, any reading I did was to teach a Sunday school class, teach a training union class, preach for Sunday morning, Sunday night, or Wednesday night, or to read what the professor was telling me I had to read in order to pass the class. I was constantly doing those things. I never had time to just sit down and read my Bible. If I went to the Bible, it was to find the sermon. You understand that? I got to preach. I need a sermon. I don't have time to study this. I need a 3-point sermon, and a poem would help. But when I graduated, I had time to read. And I was full-time, so I'd go into the office. I'd sit in my office, and I'd open my Bible, and I started reading, and not knowing any better, just like any other book, I thought, well, if you're going to read a book, you ought to start in front. And so I started in the front and was reading through my Bible. Amazing things in there. God, at the amazing things that are in there. Things that make you tilt your head and question a lot of the things you were believing and doing. But what I'm going to tell you really was a simple thing that you wouldn't think anybody would have a problem with. But when I got to Psalm 100, is where the problem started. I read Psalm 100 that morning in my office, and while I read it, then I went to Psalm 101. But as I went to the next Psalm, I heard this down on the inside of me. That's not just for Vacation Bible School, you know. Because that's where I just kind of read through it fast, because Psalm 100 is what you teach kids to quote in Vacation Bible School. But I heard that. So I went back and I read it again. And while I'm reading it this time, paying attention to what I'm reading, make a joyful noise unto Yahweh, all ye lands. Serve Him with gladness. Come before His presence with singing. As I'm reading that, I hear on the inside of me, that's the way I'm to be worshiped, you know. So I paused again. I'm not used to hearing things. Not a voice, just down on the inside. You hear these things that make you pause. You understand, you start understanding what the Scripture means when it says that the Word of Yahweh is alive. It lives. And so I back up and I start reading it again. And while I'm reading it this time, the third time, I hear on the inside, y'all sing a lot about me. And y'all sing a lot to one another. But y'all don't ever sing to me. I jumped up out of my chair. I didn't stand up. I jumped up out of my chair. I ran out of my office, ran down the hall, ran into that new sanctuary, grabbed me a Baptist hymnal, ran back to my office. I sat down and I began to thumb through it. Page 1, page 2, page 3. And as I thumbed through it, I said, oh my, we sing a lot about Him and we sing a lot to one another. We don't ever sing to Him. And I meditated on that and I prayed about that, trying to figure out what to do about that. Found some choruses where some of them were okay, some of them you had to alter them a little bit, but just little simple choruses where you could sing to Him. And so I printed those up, and one Sunday morning I stuck them inside the bulletins. I knew, I'd been around long enough, I knew not to mess with the order of service. You know what I mean? You sing a song, you have announcements. You sing 2 songs, you take up the offering. You sing another song, the pastor preaches. The preacher preaches, right? Knew not to mess with that, so I didn't mess with that. But after we'd gone through everything we were supposed to go through, and they turned it over to me, I stood up and I said, folks, inside your bulletin, there's this chorus. I want you to stand up with me. We sang about God. We sang to one another, but we haven't sang to Him. I want us to just take a moment and sing to Him. And so we did. And then the next Sunday we did the same thing. And then the deacons had a meeting with me and said, we want you to stop doing that. And I said, no, I'm not going to stop. Well, why won't you stop? I said, because I believe it's what I'm supposed to do. And had a little heated discussion about that, but they eventually left me alone. The next Sunday we did it again. And then they had a deacons meeting. They called me into it. And they said, you need to stop. Don't do that anymore. Accused the thing of being too charismatic. I didn't know what that meant. I was Baptist from, as I said, from my radiator to my tail lights, I was Baptist. Didn't know what they were talking about, but they accused it of being too charismatic. They wanted me to stop. And they said, if I didn't stop, they was going to fire me. And I said, well, men, I fully acknowledge you got the power to fire me. But I need you to understand, you won't ever be able to hire me. I'm never going to be on your payroll where I preach what you tell me to preach and I do what you tell me to do and I don't do what you forbid me to do. You can't hire me, but you full well might fire me. Well, I was correct. They could. We had one more deacon meeting before that happened where they were trying to persuade me not to do it anymore. And I thought, I was excited about what I was seeing in the Bible. And I thought if I could just get them to see what I'm seeing, they'd get excited too. And actually, it was carrying over into the congregation. We were having some of the best services we'd ever had. New people were coming. It was awesome. And so when they called this deacons meeting and we sat down, I brought my Bible. And I said, guys, let me just show you what I'm seeing. I want you to see what I see. And so I started reading things to them out of the Bible. And one of them would say something. I said, I know exactly. Let me show you this. And I'd read them something else out of the Bible. This went on for just a little while. And finally, the chairman of the deacons slammed his hands down on the desk and said, preacher, put that Bible up. Listen to me now. He said, we understand that what you're saying is Bible, and what you're doing is Bible. What you have to understand is we don't want to have anything to do with that here. What do you say to that? Sunday night they called a deacons meeting. A business meeting. You ever been to a business meeting? Motion was put forth to fire the preacher. Got to have a second to have discussion on it, so somebody seconded it, and then the discussion took place. That was quite an experience sitting there on that front row, listening to the things these people said. People I'd poured my heart and life into for several years, saying things like this. Well, we don't understand what's going on. But if the deacons say we need to fire him, I guess we need to fire him. That's the things they said. One lady, I'm sitting on the front row on the right-hand side. One lady on the left side near the back stood up and she said, Brother Steve. And I turned around and looked over my shoulder. She said, Brother Steve, I don't understand where we're going, but you know what they say, right? You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them flock together. I turned around to Marie and I said, if it's true you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them flock together, I'm going to vote for me to be fired. They passed out secret ballots and they voted, and the vote was something like 55% to 45% to fire me. And the chairman of the deacons, after they tallied it all up, the chairman of the deacons said, well, Brother Steve, it's passed. Here's the votes. This is your last service. I stood up and I walked up there and I got close enough where he could hear me. Nobody else could. And I said, Ed, I know the bylaws as well as you do. And you know that what you just said is not true. By the bylaws, you got to have 2/3 vote to do this. But I have no desire to split this church in half. If y'all want me gone, I'll be gone. But I want you to know that I know it's not legal. Then I turned around and I asked those folks, I said, how many of y'all came here because you believe that God told you to come? And they all raised their hand. And I said, if you leave because you got mad about what happened here tonight, you'll be wrong. I did not want to split that church. I loved it too much to do that. And so, Marie and I got Brian and Amanda. Those were the only 2 children we had at the time, and we walked out. They not only fired us, but kicked us out of the place we was living too. So it was quite a situation to walk through. One day, Marie and I are riding down the road and we're listening to that song. The song came on the radio. Is it Three Dog Night or something? I don't know. I've never been to Spain. Anybody? And I told her, I said, there's a spiritual song in there. And she said, in that? No. I said, yeah, there is. And I always keep fast food napkins above my sun visor. So I pulled one down, took out my pen, and here's what I wrote. Well, I used to be a Baptist, but they didn't like my praising. They said if I was going to stay there, I'd have to stop my singing. I kept on singing, I kept on praising. Soon, I was leaving. And now they say I'm Pentecostal, they say I'm charismatic, they say I'm too emotional, they say I'm a fanatic, but it's so fantastic, I just can't help it. I got to shout it. And now, I'm praying for the sick. I'm laying hands upon them. I'm casting out their demons, putting holy power on them. The good news telling them that Yahweh loves them. He's going to heal them. Well, I used to be a Baptist, but they didn't like my praising. I'm going to speed up now and bring us up to speed. Shortly after that, I had preached a revival at a church in St. Clair County called Macedonia. When they heard I was no longer where I was at, they called. One of the deacons called and said, hey, our pastor is retiring. Would you come be our pastor? And I said, no, y'all don't want that. And he said, yes, we do. I said, no, you don't. I said, because I'm preaching the whole Bible now. I'm not worried about Baptist doctrine. I'm preaching the whole Bible now, and y'all don't want that. And he said, that's just what we want. I said, I tell you what, I knew their pastor. He had been a Southern Baptist all his life. I said, you go tell him what I said. And don't call me back till you talk to him. A couple of days later, he called back and he said, quote unquote, we told the pastor what you said, and he said, that's just what this church needs. I said, all right, then set me up a meeting with the deacons. They set me up a meeting with the deacons, and I went over there. And we sat down in a room around the table. And they all, with one accord, said they wished I'd consider coming there and being their pastor. And after I'd listened to them talk, I said to them, men, I held my Bible up. I said, men, for the first time in my life, I got a whole Bible. And nobody is going to take it away from me ever again. I said, if it's in here, I'm going to preach it. If it's in here, I'm going to teach it. I'm going to live it. I'm going to believe it. You're not going to take my Bible away from me and tell me that something is off limits to deal with. One of the guys with tears running down his face said, that's just what we need. I said again, you call that pastor up and you tell him everything I said tonight. And don't call me back till you talk to him. They called me back a couple of days later and said, we told him what you said about preaching the whole Bible. He said that's just what this church needs. I said, all right, when you want me there. He retired at the end of that month. The first Sunday of the next month, I went there and preached my first sermon on a Sunday morning. We had a glorious time. This is the part I know I think I've shared several times, but something happened after that sermon. I preached loud, but I didn't strain my voice. Something weird happened. My voice. I'm telling you, by mid-afternoon, I could barely talk like this. It hurt to talk. And I did everything I knew to do, drank everything I knew to drink. Nothing was happening. So, Sunday night, when everybody got there, I went to the sound guy and I told him, I can barely talk. I want you to turn that microphone up as loud as you can turn it. You seldom have to use a microphone when I talk, but I want it turned up. And that night, what I did is I took my Bible and I started in the book of Exodus. And all I did, without commentary, without preaching, all I did that night was I went from verse to verse, passage to passage, and read everything I could find on healing. And you got to understand that in my studies, I'd become excited about what I was finding in Torah. I didn't even know to call it Torah back then. But I was excited about what I was finding in Torah because I began to discover I was being lied to because they told me I had a new and better covenant, but they were telling me healing had been taken out of the new covenant. Well, how is it new and better if you're taking out a good thing? Couldn't understand how it would be better. I was going back and looking in Torah and finding all of these promises of blessings and healing, and I was excited about it. And so that night, I read what I was discovering in the Old Testament about healing. And when I got through, I said, now folks, I don't know what to do because, again, I could barely talk. I said, but is there anybody in here sick? And 2 people raised their hand. And I said, well, why don't you come up here and let's pray? Well, when I said, come up here and let's pray, I didn't count them, but there were at least 20 people that came up. Only 2 raised their hand, but at least 20 people came up. And they did a very un-Baptist thing. In a Baptist church, when you come to the front, you line up in a row. And one by one, you talk to the preacher, and he may or may not direct you to the altar, but you talk to the preacher, you come up in a row. These folks came up and lined up across the front. I would later discover that's an ordinary thing in a Pentecostal Word of Faith church, but it wasn't common in a Baptist church. And so it stunned me. And I'm standing there looking at that, not knowing what to do. I stood there, it seemed like forever. I'm sure it was just a few seconds, but I stood there for a long time just looking at it because I didn't know what to do. You got to understand, I was a Baptist. I finally took a deep breath, walked off the podium, or the platform, off the platform, went down to the person farthest to my left. I said, what is wrong with you? I think they said something like, I've got a headache or a stomach ache. And I said, whew, good. Because it's not anything serious. So prayed for them, for their healing. Went to the next one, same thing. Went to the next one, same thing. Went to the next one, same thing. Simple things, we pray. Everything's great. Finally get to a lady who was the wife of the music director who was also a deacon. Got to her and I said, what's wrong with you? And she said, I've got something bad going on with my kidney. And it hurts all the time. And she is explaining what was wrong with her kidney. And I did something I'd never done in all the years I'd pastored Baptist churches. In all the years I'd preached and pastored, never done this. But I looked around her to where Marie was, and I said, Marie, come here. She stood up, walked up there. I said, I want you to lay your hands on her back right there, and I'm going to put my hand on your hand, and we're going to pray for her. And so we did. I prayed for her. And she thanked us, and she went to sit down. I stepped to the next person. Marie's still standing. I stepped to the next person, and it's a teenage girl. And I said, what's wrong with you? And she said, I'm deaf in this ear. And I got pain that goes down the back of my neck. And her mother is standing behind her and said, it's been that way for years and years. And I said, okay. Well, we're going to pray. But I'm not real enthused about it. I'm standing here. I didn't just jump on it and pray. Okay, we're going to pray. And while I'm standing there hesitating, Marie said, I think it's her eustachian tube. I said, what's a eustachian tube? She said, I don't know. I said, then what makes you think it's a eustachian tube? She said, that's the word I see. I said, see? She said, yeah. And she reached from my pocket. I always kept a pen in my coat pocket. And I pulled a pen out and gave it to her, and she went to the communion table. There were always tissues up there. She pulled out a tissue, and she wrote this word out, eustachian tube. She said, I see that word. I folded that back up, stuck it in my pocket, and I walked over to that young girl, and with boldness and confidence I said, we just been shown what your problem is. God just told us what your problem is. We're going to pray for you, and you're going to be healed. As we laid our hands on her and prayed for her, she said, my ear popped, and I can hear a little bit. I said, if you can hear a little bit, you're going to hear a lot. He's healing you. You're good. Go sit down. And then I went from person to person down the rest of the aisle. We didn't make a big deal out of it. Went person to person down the rest of the aisle. Most of them were tummy aches, leg aches, headaches, something, you know. And we dismissed. That was on Sunday night. I went home. Went into my closet where my books from Sanford were. I knew I had a biology book. You couldn't Google stuff back then. So I found my biology book, brought it, set it on the bed, and flipped on my biology book, found the diagram of the ear, and sure enough, eustachian tube is a tube in your ear that runs right down the back of your neck. Pulled my tissue out, and sure enough, miracle, Marie had spelled it right.
That was a miracle.
See, the Ruach HaKodesh knows how to spell. Wow. So we rejoice. We'd never seen anything like this in our life. It was awesome. About 10:30 that night, we went to bed, and about 10:30 that night, somewhere around that time, my phone rang. That's one of them things you had to plug into the wall. We kept it sitting by the bed. I reached over, picked it up. Back then, you didn't know who was calling. You just had to pick it up and find out, right? So I picked the phone up. I said, hello. And it's the minister of music's wife, the deacon's wife. She said, Steve, this is Susan. Hello, Susan. How are you? She said, sorry to call so late, but you know, we prayed for me to be healed tonight. My heart nearly jumped out of my chest. I said, yes, ma'am, we sure did. She said, well, if it's okay with you, I'd rather God not heal me. I said, excuse me? She said, if it's okay with you, I'd rather God not heal me. I said, well, Susan, I don't know a whole lot about this, but I'm pretty sure if you don't want to be healed, you're not going to be healed. She said, okay, good, thank you, good night. Hung up. Marie said, what was that about? I said, it started. I said, we've stirred them up. Sure enough, that night the deacons had a meeting. And she would rather than get cross with the deacons and the leadership, she'd rather keep her sickness. Because the deacons didn't like what happened that night. I preached Wednesday night. This was my discovery of Mark chapter 7. Changed my life forever. Where you set aside, you lay aside, you reject, and you make void Yahweh's word so that you can hold on to your traditions and the doctrines of men taught as commandments. That was my first introduction to Mark chapter 7, and it just began to come alive to me. The more I studied it, the more I could see. And so Wednesday night, I preached from Mark chapter 7. Sunday morning, I preached from Mark chapter 7. Sunday night, I preached from Mark chapter 7. Wednesday night, the deacons had a meeting. Sunday morning, the deacons had a meeting. Wednesday night, the deacons had a meeting. Every time I'd preach, so I'd preached there 5 times in total. They'd had 4 deacons meetings when I got through. All right? A deacon meeting after every time I preached except for one. One of the deacons was bold enough to come up to me and said, I didn't like that prayer line thing you did. Okay. He said, who do you think you are? I said, excuse me? Who do you think you are laying your hands on people? He said, the Bible says that you're to anoint them with oil and the prayer of faith will save the sick. I said, okay. how do you want me to get the oil on them? With a squirt bottle? Or is it okay if I lay my hands on them? Well, that made him mad and he left. Chairman Deacons called, wanted to know if they could come to my house. I said, sure. They came over. They sat there and talked about the weather and football and everything else except what they came to talk about. You could tell they were fidgeting and nervous. Finally, I said to the chairman of the deacons, who was also the principal of the local high school, I said, what's going on? He said, well, you know, we've been having a lot of meetings. I said, yeah, I've noticed. He said, a lot of people don't like stuff you're preaching. I said, is that a fact? He said, yeah. He said, but every time they bring it up in a meeting, I have to remind them that you're preaching exactly what you said you're going to preach. That you didn't come in here under some kind of deception, that you told us exactly what you was going to preach before you came. I said, yes, I did. He said, so we can't be mad at you. I said, okay, good. He said, but we just don't know what we're going to do. I said, would it help you if I don't come back? Oh, would you please? I said, Ed, if you don't want me back, I won't come back. Okay, thank you. And they stood up and left. Rejection's a hard thing to deal with. You know, especially when I told you, when I first started preaching, I was celebrated and everybody wanted me to come, but now I'm facing rejection after rejection. Another church in St. Clair County heard that I was no longer preaching anywhere. I think it was Piney Hill or something like that. And they wanted to know if they could come over, and their deacons came over. There wasn't about 4 or 5 of them. They came over to my house. They sat down, explained that they were without a pastor, sure would like if I would consider coming and preaching a trial sermon and being their pastor. And I listened to everything they had to say. And then I said, well, men, I'll be more than glad to consider that. But I need to let you know up front that I think that the most unbiblical and ungodly creature on the face of this planet is a Baptist deacon. I'm not saying I was right to say it. I'm just telling y'all that's what I said. They didn't say a word. They stood up, walked across my living room, went out the front door, and the last one going out slammed my front door. Wham! I stood up, walked across my living room, opened the door, and when I stepped out on the porch, they had just opened the doors of their car, and in true Beverly Hillbilly style, I said, y'all come back now, you hear? And they spun the tires as they left my driveway. I'd spent my whole life preparing to pastor Southern Baptist Church. I had gone to Southern Baptist School. I could not see myself being anything but a Southern Baptist. The last semester that I was in school at Sanford University, a professor called me in, and he sat me in his office and he said, where are you going to seminary? I said, nowhere right now. He said, Steve, you got to enroll in seminary. I said, no, sir, not right now. He said, Steve, God did not call you to pastor small country churches. You've got to go to seminary. I said to him, I respect what you're saying and I appreciate what you're saying, but God sent me to Glenwood Baptist Church, and until He tells me I can leave, I'm not leaving. Well, little did I know the deacons were going to take that upon themselves to tell me not to leave. To tell me to leave. But that's the way I thought. I wasn't going to go to seminary just to get a bigger church or to get more of a degree. But I always thought I would be a Southern Baptist preacher. Couldn't imagine myself being anything but a Southern Baptist preacher. And so when all of that begins to disintegrate in front of me, I became bitter. I became angry. I was thrilled at the things I was finding in the Bible, but the things I was finding in the Bible were adding to my frustration because I was reading about praise. I was reading about healing. I was studying Christmas, studying Easter. Again, back before you had Google, I would have to drive to Birmingham and to the library and pull books off the shelf, and I'd sit on the floor and was reading this stuff and couldn't believe what I was reading. And so here I was overwhelmed at the lies that I'd been taught all of my life. And disappointed that I'd never questioned it once. Disappointed in me that I'd never questioned it once. And saddened that I so believed the lies that I was teaching it to other people. And so this frustration and this anger and this disappointment and disillusionment, it starts getting the better of me. And I become a person you wouldn't want to know. Had a small stint at Bread of Life. Bill and his family were members there. And I'll save that story for another day, but it was weird. We just went there to visit on a Sunday night, and the pastor of that little congregation, wasn't all that little, the pastor of that congregation, at the end of the Sunday night service, stood up and said, well, it's good to have Steve and Marie with us here tonight. And Steve, will you stand up? And I stood up, and he said, Steve's going to be your new pastor. And he turned around and walked out the door. Well, that was a bad thing to do because it didn't take my anger, but I think 3 weeks to kill that place. We hung on for a year and a half, but I killed it quick. And after that fizzled out and died, I determined that I was going to prove to everybody that I was anything but a preacher. Took a job at 84 Lumber. I poured myself into it, and I poured myself into Little League sports. And did all I could to show I was no longer a preacher. You look up road rage in the dictionary, it probably had my picture back then. I was mad at the world and I didn't know why. More than once, I've jumped out of my car and tried to jerk a door open on somebody else's car, and they'd take off and nearly jerk my arm off. I was not in a good place. When you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, you can't find peace. No matter what I did, I couldn't find peace. And I was losing my family. I'm about to wrap this up. This went on for several years, and I was losing my family. And as I began to seek help for that, praying for that, calling out to, the only thing I knew to call him back in was God, but calling out to God for that. Because I didn't mean to take it to the place that I'd lose my family. I just wanted everybody to know I wasn't a preacher. But I was losing everything. Well, I heard down on the inside something that I'd heard years before. Remember when Macedonia Baptist Church came to see me and they wanted me gone? I had started listening to a guy on the radio. And when that church let me go, one morning while I was minding my own business, I heard on the inside, go submit yourself to Pastor Scott Webb. And before we went to Bread of Life to visit there, we went to visit Word of Life, where Pastor Scott Webb was. He preached. He had a radio program, and he had a little storefront church in Center Point, Alabama. Well, I had just pastored a church that had a 400-seat sanctuary. And I walked in this little storefront, and they've got a band up there, drums and guitars and all kind of stuff, and I didn't like it, and I didn't like him. And more important than anything else, I despise the word submit, because that's what I heard. Go submit. And so I dismissed that and went to Branchville, Alabama instead, and thus started that horrible road that I just described to you. But when I began to cry out, searching for help, guess what I heard in my spirit? Go submit yourself to Pastor Scott Webb. Desperate enough then that I'd do that. But by that time, when I went to do that, he had this big, beautiful building, hundreds and hundreds of people, staff. So in order to submit to him, I had to submit to the person who was submitted to the person that was submitted to him. But I did it. Yahweh restored my family, restored me, allowed me to start studying faith, which was a beautiful thing to study. I loved studying faith. Began to discover a lot of things that I'd never discovered, and began to feel that stir on the inside again to preach. So we began to pray about this. Now you understand this didn't happen in months, it happened in years. Several years later, Maria and I are talking, and I said, I think I'm supposed to go to school. She agreed. We began to look first at Rhema Bible Training Center, because that's where Scott Webb had gone. Couldn't find any peace there. We visited there, didn't resonate with us. And then we heard about Jerry Savelle's Bible School over in Crowley, Texas, right outside of Fort Worth. We went and visited there, and we just knew when we got there that was where we were supposed to be. And so as I'm trying to sort through all of this, I hear on the inside, I heard it on the inside, go ask for permission to go. Ask for permission? I don't need Scott Webb's permission to go to Fort Worth. And that was how adamant I was on the inside for weeks. And then one day I'm sitting reading my Bible again. And there is a theme in all of this. And that theme being that every time I had trouble, it's because I was reading my Bible. Good trouble. But you read your Bible, it'll stir things up. I was reading my Bible, and I was reading about Moses at the burning bush, and he and Yahweh's conversation. And when all of that was done, and he was to go to Egypt as Yahweh had commanded him, you know what the first thing Moses did was? He went home to his father-in-law Jethro, for whom he had worked for many years. And he did not say, hey, I'm going to Egypt, see you later. He told Jethro what had happened, and he asked permission to go. And the Rock Hakodesh said to me, you haven't even had a burning bush experience. I agreed. Let me explain to you why I didn't want to ask Scott Webb. I didn't want to ask Scott Webb because in the years I had been there, I'd seen other men who thought they were supposed to go out and start ministries or go somewhere and do something. And Scott Webb, in essence, would tell them in a nice way, sit down, shut up, no, you're not. I even had one person advise me I wouldn't go tell him if I was you because he'll squash it. Called him up, asked for an appointment. Maria and I went to see he and his wife. We sat down. And he asked me what was going on, and I told him that I felt like I was supposed to go to school. And I told him I felt like I was supposed to go to Jerry Savelle's Bible School. He asked me why there. I explained it to him best I could. And he said, why do you think you're supposed to go to school? I said, it's not so much for the school, sir. I said, I got to jump off this train I'm on. I've jumped on this train with 84 Lumber, with a career It's taken me as far away from my calling as it can possibly take me. I said, I got to jump off this train. It's more about getting off this train than it is about going there to get school. And he said, you're absolutely right. That's what it is. I said, I'm not here to tell you I'm going to school. I'm here to ask your permission to go to school. He said, you have my permission. Later, the minister of music would tell me that he told her that in all the years he had been there, I was the only person who had ever approached a subject like that correctly. Well, imagine that. It was the Ruach who directed me to do it. We sold our home. We sold most of our possessions, loaded up what we had left. We went to Fort Worth. I think I was 43 years old. Marie and I and our 4 children headed to Fort Worth. We had no savings. As I've told you many times before, I had $1,600. When I got there, it didn't take about a week for that to disappear. But almost every day, the Ruach HaKodesh, the Spirit, would tell us what to do, and we would do it, and He came through for us over and over and over again. That's a whole different sermon. We'll preach about those miracles another day, but it was one miracle after another. It was amazing, but it was always, He would tell us to do something, we'd do it, and then He'd come through. He'd say, do this, we'd do it, and He'd come through. He'd tell us to do things that sounded absolutely just crazy in our head, but we would do it, and He would come through. I ended up being not only in school there, but ended up being the associate pastor of Jerry Savelle's church here in Heritage of Faith Christian Center. Had a very prestigious position and loved it. But when we first arrived there, let me say this, we didn't have a television set. We'd gotten rid of it, so we didn't have a television set. So you know what we did instead as a family? We sat down around the table and we studied the book of Acts. And some other students there heard we were doing that and asked if they could come over and study with us. And they came to study with us, and I told them up front, we use the name YAHWEH. And we're studying things like healing and the Sabbath and Christmas and Easter. They said, great. They came and studied with us, and eventually one of those families moved here for a while to be a part of what we were doing. But we had some marvelous times, some confrontational times as well. One of the staff members was going to get married and asked me if I'd do the wedding. I said, absolutely, I'll be glad to. As we got closer to the wedding, she asked if she'd have a copy of the wedding ceremony. I said, absolutely, be glad to give it to you. I gave it to her. She came back the next day, walked in my office, set it down and said, that is a beautiful ceremony. Thank you. Could I ask for one revision? I said, absolutely. She said, would you take out the name YAHWEH and just use God or Lord instead? I said, absolutely not. That's the way I do them, and if you want it done a different way, you need a different preacher, not me. So there was some confrontations that began to build over time. The Ruach began to speak to us about going to North Alabama, Huntsville, Alabama, to start a church. We knew nobody in Huntsville, Alabama. Nobody. And every time we tell somebody we feel like we're supposed to go to Huntsville, they say, who do you know there? We don't know anybody. Then why Huntsville? Don't know. All we can tell you is that's what we feel. We moved to Holly Pond, Alabama. We left Texas, moved to Holly Pond, and then we launched this church. It was called the Church of Huntsville, and it started March 24th, 2002. I would have been, I was wrong. When I went to school, I was 41. I'd have been 43 when we started the church. We met on a Sunday morning at Grissom High School in the audio room. It was a miracle to get in there. We were a Word of Faith church. We emphasized praise and worship. We emphasized healing, prosperity. We emphasized faith, but we used the name of YAHWEH. We met at Grissom High School for a while. We left Grissom High School and eventually moved into a child care place called Meemaw's, so that we could meet more than just once a week. And we met at Meemaw's. The most amazing thing about Meemaw's was the room we met in, they had started painting a mural on the wall, and there was a girl painted in a swing on the mural, and they never put a head on her. So we had a headless swinger in that room for the whole time we was there. They never put a head on this young girl. Don't know why. We met there for a while. There was a building that came open, available just down the road there in South Huntsville. We called it the Pink Palace because when you walked in it, every wall in there was painted Pepto-Bismol pink. It was ugly. It had been a beer joint, and it was so rough they painted the walls pink trying to settle people down, hoping it would make them more passive. Anybody that lived in that area would say, boy, that used to be a rough place. If you didn't have a knife and a gun when you came in the door, they would give you one. It was bad. That's what they said about the place. But we set out to remodel that thing, and we spent somewhere near $30,000 remodeling a place we were leasing, and that became a home for us for several years. While we were at Grissom, then we moved to Meemaw's. While we were at Grissom, that's where we met Conrad and Lisa. I don't think we'd been meeting but a month or so before you guys showed up. Is that right? It was awesome to meet them. Back then, we also had communion every Sunday. We just had communion. So allow me to tell this memory. The main memory I remember about that is Conrad had agreed to help us pass out communion, and he came down one Sunday morning with a communion, with a juice tray, and Marie and Brian were our music team, and he walked up to the platform, it was a high platform, and he handed it up, and Marie stooped down to get her juice, and Conrad pulled it back and said, "Have you been a good girl?" And I wanted to say no, but I didn't. But I thought, oh, this is a guy I want to get to know. And then when we got to Meemaw's, I think that's where the McAvoys started coming. Or was you at Grissom as well? At the Pink Palace. Okay. And then Matthew started coming, and to his benefit, he met a young lady there by the name of India, and they married and created the Moore family that is now a big part of our fellowship here. We had a lot of people who began to come up from Bluntsville, and we saw a lot of growth when we moved into that building in South Huntsville. Still word of faith. Still word of faith. But within a year of being there, you know, Easter rolls around, and I preach a sermon, "We will never celebrate Easter at the Church of Huntsville." And I was adamant. Boom. Never. We lost about half our folks. We had got to where we was running over 100 folks, 120 folks. We lost half of them. And then Christmas rolls around, and you say, we're not going to celebrate Christmas. Boom, you lose more. And while we were there, we had gotten to a place where I could devote more time to that church instead of so much time away. And so we created what we called COG meetings. Children of God in the kingdom of God, we would meet on Wednesday nights, and we were studying things, and that actually began to change our very direction. The most impactful thing we did was study Matthew 13, the 7 parables told there. And from it we discovered that what Yeshua was trying to tell us is the church is not near as big as it looks. There's a lot of people pretending to be a part of His kingdom that are not. All 7 parables preach that sermon. And so as we begin to see that, and we're losing folks because we want to be a part of His kingdom, not a part of a big association. We want to be a part of His kingdom. And so the more we set ourselves to be a part of His kingdom and to talk about the feast and the Moedim and the reject pagan festivities, the more people we were losing. And then in our prayer groups, we had Teresa and Marie and Rita would meet to pray. And in my own time, we began to hear, go east, go east, go east. And they just kept hearing that over and over again in their prayer times. And we didn't know what that meant, but we knew what we were hearing. And we didn't know where we were going, but we started packing. We started showing up down there in that building that we loved. We put $30,000 in it. We loved it. We didn't want to go anywhere, but we started packing because he said go east. And we packed up everything we knew to pack. And eventually we knew we were supposed to leave, and we were supposed to go east across the hill to Hampton Cove, and we went and started meeting in the Hampton Inn and Suites. We called it the HIS building, H-I-S, Hampton Inns and Suites, and we started meeting there. We're meeting there on Sunday morning. Now, Yahweh is so amazing because he told us, get out. When he started telling us go east, I started digging my feet in and saying, no. I put blood, sweat, tears into this place. I don't want to go. He said, if you don't go, you'll die. If you stay in this city, you will die. I kept hearing that on the inside. We went across that hill and we started meeting in Hampton Inn and Suites, and we started teaching on the Sabbath. Because we couldn't deny it anymore. The Scriptures teaches it. The Sunday stuff comes from pagan roots. It's been pushed on us by the Roman Catholic Church. When you meet on Sunday, you're following them instead of the Scripture. And so we began to preach on the Sabbath. I preached on it one morning just as hard as I could preach on it. And when I got through, Conrad said, then when are we going to meet on the Sabbath? I said, next Saturday, sir. And from that time on, we started meeting on the Sabbath, and we lost even more people. And then it was then that I understood. See, it cost us a lot of money to stay in that building in South Huntsville, a lot of money. That's the reason a lot of preachers won't preach the truth. Is because they know that if they lose people, they lose ties. If they lose ties, then they can't pay the bills. Yahweh delivered us out from under that before it was ever an issue. Yep. We didn't have to leave that building because we couldn't make the payments. We left that building in good standing. Yeah. Well able to make the payments. But we obeyed Yahweh because Yahweh knew what was coming even though I couldn't see what was coming. We started keeping the Sabbath, and when we started keeping the Sabbath, the revelation began to come almost like just snowballing. Yahweh would talk to us about the Moedim, and we started seeing how perfectly these things parallel the life of Yeshua. And it started changing everything about us. We weren't there long till we understood that we are not the Church of Huntsville, but we are the Assembly of Yahweh in North Alabama. The very first service we ever had, we had it put on our banner, exalting His name. That's who we are. We are His assembly, the Assembly of Yahweh in North Alabama. And so we changed our name. That was, I think 2013, 2014, somewhere around there. And shortly after changing our name, and shortly after meeting at the Hampton Inn and Suites, we began to meet in homes. We met in Conrad and Lisa's home. We met in Bob and Maria's home. We met in Bill and Teresa's home. We met in an exotic animal auction barn in Huntsville, Alabama. And when I say it was a barn, I mean it was a barn not cleaned up for services like a cowboy church. I'm talking about a barn where they might have had an auction the day before. It was nasty and it stunk, but that's where we would meet. And we'd meet at my home, and then we eventually got to meeting in Spencer and Stephanie's home. But we have just for the last 6 years been going home to home, and it's been awesome to be able to study Torah and to do all of that. I said all that to say, somebody asked me not long ago, when did you commit fully to keep Torah? And as I thought about the question they had asked me, I realized that there's not one day you can point to. You can commit to keeping Torah today and say, okay, that's what I'm going to do. If it's written in Torah, I'm going to keep it. But the transformation is not something that happens in a day. The transformation is a journey. Because what happens is you study Torah and you get confronted with something Torah says, and you see it conflicts with something you've been taught all of your life. Some doctrine, some teaching, some belief that's been passed down to you by denomination or by family member, and there's a conflict. And so on this journey, you have to decide, am I going to set aside Torah, or am I going to set aside this commandment of men and this tradition of men? And so it's been a journey, month after month, and it's not over. That's what I'm here to share with you. It's not over. The journey continues. Every time we discover something new in Torah, we have to decide whether we're going to keep that or not, whether we're going to follow that or not. This has been for me a 43-year journey, and it started the night of my ordination. When they said, if we need a promise from you that if it's not Baptist, you won't preach it, that's when my journey started. When I put my foot down and say, no, if I believe it and if I see it in the Bible, I'm going to preach it. And I've held true to that to the best of my ability for the last 43 years. I've made mistakes. I've gone off track. But we as the Assembly of Yahweh in North Alabama are doing our best to just follow truth. We don't want to be a denomination. We want to follow truth. Now, along this journey, I said it's been a journey. You understand, I lost my Southern Baptist credentials. I lost my Southern Baptist prestige. I lost family and friends and associates in that circle. I lost my Word of Faith connections. I lost family members who are still Southern Baptist to their core. I lost friends. I lost congregations. But I wouldn't go back to it for any amount of money. I wouldn't go back to that stuff for anything. To anyone who is trapped in any denomination, I would offer this advice. Take one step toward truth. Any truth you see in the Bible, take one step toward it. And then confirm it. Is what you think you're seeing true? And if it is, commit yourself to it. You don't have to change everything. Just if you see one truth, step to it. Confirm it, and then commit to it. And then when you see another truth, take a step toward it. And as long as you'll keep stepping toward it, Yahweh will keep showing you things. And when He shows you, you step to it, and He shows you, and you step to it, and He shows you, and you step to it. And don't even think about those you're leaving behind. Because you're going to leave some folks behind who refuse to step toward it. You can't listen to them. You can't be worried about them. Just keep going. And eventually you're going to look back and see how far Yahweh brought you. And you're going to be amazed at how He got you here. And there's going to be some battle scars from it. But I promise you, He meant it when He said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. There's a freedom that comes from embracing truth that you can't get anywhere else. And when you know that you are following what's written in the Bible instead of some commandment of men, it changes everything. There's a reality that sinks in that cannot even be explained. Don't look back at what you're losing. Like Paul, the denominational leaders can and will stir up those that you leave behind. But like Paul, you'll discover a truth that you'll be willing to be beaten over before you'll give it up. Yeah. Like Paul in the book of Acts, I would say to those who defend the Baptist doctrine and the Word of Faith doctrine and see me as their enemy, I'd simply say I am truly a man who was born a Southern Baptist. I was raised at New Lebanon Baptist Church. I was trained at the feet of Dr. Bryan and Dr. Joines. I was trained at the feet of W.A. Criswell. I was trained at the feet of these Southern Baptists. I was zealous toward God. I was zealous toward Jesus. I was zealous toward the Southern Baptist Convention and toward the Southern Baptist doctrine. I was where most Baptists still are today. I was truly trained in the Word of Faith, trained at the feet of Scott Webb, trained at the feet of Jerry Savelle, trained at the feet of Kenneth Copeland. I was zealous for God and for Jesus and for the Word of Faith doctrine. But when there was a conflict, I found, like Paul, it was hard to kick against the pricks. It was hard to keep believing the stuff I was being taught when it contradicted what I was reading in my Bible. At some point, you've got to decide, am I going to be a Bible follower or am I going to be locked into this denomination for whatever benefit it can bring me? I promise you that benefit is temporary. But the benefit of keeping Torah is eternal. Don't y'all wish I still preach 15-minute sermons? I know we've been here a long time. But before I close, I do want to do one thing. I haven't been on this journey by myself. So Marie, come up here, please. Come here. I want you to stand in front of that camera right there. Because Facebook people, YouTube people see me all the time. They don't know who my family is. This is Marie, my wife. We were married in 1977. Thank you. Come here, Brian. Bring your family up here. See if y'all can get all in that picture there. This is Brian, my son, oldest son Brian, and his wife Krista. This is Bill Brooks' daughter, and that's Sam, Pepper, and Brooks. Their 3 children, and what a blessing it is to have your family locked in with you. They went with me to Texas. They came with me to North Alabama. I can't tell you how awesome. I am telling you how awesome it is. It is awesome. Thank you. Did Amanda have to leave? My oldest daughter, Amanda, and her husband, Dave, Will, and Eva, are a vital part of what we do here as well. We'll introduce her to you later. But they had other things they had to do today. Come on up here, Stephanie Spencer. Will, come on up. I thought Will had young too, so.
We'll adopt some.
There you go. I need you to stand over here so that you're in. Come on over here, Spencer. See that camera right there? There you go. This is my youngest daughter, Stephanie, right here, and her husband, Spencer, and my youngest grandchild, Nate the Great. And this is my oldest grandson. This is Amanda and Dave's son, Will. So I just wanted y'all to know my family. Thank you very much. Hey, Stephanie, do you have that data I had asked you for? No. Okay. All right. Stephanie had shared with me some data that I just don't look at, but we're thrilled that how many different folks listen to us on Facebook or watch us on Facebook, and the different cities and states they're from, and even all of the different countries that they're from. And I think we have 700 or 800 folks on Facebook that follow us now. And when Stephanie told me, we rejoiced because we remember when it got up to 20, we just were elated. And then YouTube, a little over 1,300 folks. It's just to keep Torah, you have to reach way out to find other folks who are keeping Torah. And it's good to be able to create that communion and to find those others that you can fellowship with. So I sincerely mean it when I say I appreciate these folks who watch every week on Facebook. And then those of you who made long trips today to come and be with us, we thank you. Y'all want to eat, I know you do. I'm just overwhelmed because I love you so much. And those of you who have joined the journey are a blessing to me. It encourages me. But those of you who have been here through all the battles and refused to walk or run away, wow. If YAHWEH, if Yeshua said that you can't even give a cup of cold water in His name and it go unrewarded, well, how much more for those of you who have just continued to support this work in every way you possibly can for almost 20 years. I love you very much, and I admire you and respect you as a servant of Yeshua and of His Father Yahweh. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make His face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. As His name is put upon you, so shall He Himself bless you.